Hi, my name is Neil Parsons, and I have a show called 1,000 Words at Winnipeg Fringe Festival 2022. The return, we're back, live and in color. And I'm glad to be back with my first solo show, having performed here before with my company, The Fourth Wall. We have a variety show called Fruit Flies Like a Banana, in which we're all conservatory-trained musicians who dance and act while we play, but my show is a departure from that. It's more of a storytelling show, though I still play the trombone and dance, and physical storytelling is a little bit more what I'm going for.
And now, this play is based upon your father fighting in the war in Vietnam.
Right.
So did you collaborate quite strongly? I understand your dad passed away. Before he passed away, you could collaborate quite strongly, and he shared the story with you?
Yeah, I wish I had been able to collaborate more back and forth with him face-to-face. But he left a lot of documentation. So I have a binder of almost 200 pages of typed up chronicling of his time there, some of which was typed up by my grandmother, either listening to audio recordings that he sent home as letters or, reading his quite messy handwriting in letters that he sent home. He also, of course, left those audio recordings, some of which I discovered while I was researching. I didn't even know that those existed until I started working on the script. And I was visiting my mother. She thought she was going to find a box of, photos and negatives, and then we find these audio recordings. So I got those digitized and had the amazing privilege of hearing my father as a 24-year-old man while he was in Vietnam, talking about his experience there. So that was a beautiful discovery, and as soon as I heard that recording, I knew I needed to include it in the show, along with the photographs, along with the written accounts that he had.
So did it take you quite a while to put everything together? Because you had music in there, pictures, and you were reading things, and you were dancing, so it looks like a lot of involvement in this play. Yeah.
There are many layers to this, and over the years, my father told the stories, I sort of absorbed them, and when I first started working on this, sort of at the end of the Fringe season 2018, it was actually the last night of Fringe in Edmonton, when I was talking to a friend about some of these stories and some of my stories, and she said, "That's your next Fringe show, right?" I was like, I don't know. And then I started thinking, oh, yes, this is my next Fringe show. So then I started working, writing, researching, actually going through the documents that he had left for the first time, and sort of squaring up my memory of his storytelling with the words that he used at the time, and piecing it together. And then also piecing together some of my own stories of injury and recovery as companion pieces to the stories from Vietnam. So even though much of the show is in the context of the Vietnam War, overall it's a play about resilience and about human pain, trauma, but recovery and healing. And there are definitely specifics about the Vietnam War, but it's a much more universal story. And one of the things that I learned in the process was studying and researching PTSD, which is something that he had never talked about that aspect of it until a couple months before he died, and conducted an interview where he mentioned his PTSD specifically. And I went, wow, okay, now I'm starting to piece together more of this story. About the time that I started thinking, I think I need to create a piece out of this, then, he passed away. So I did not get the opportunity that I would have wished for to collaborate more in depth with him. But thankfully, like I said, there's plenty of documentation left behind for me to put together a lot of storytelling.
So you could maybe do a sequel then, or a follow-up to this play then, with other documentation?
There are plenty of stories and snippets of stories and photographs that could expand this work quite a bit. I'm not sure if a live performance as a sequel to it is what I might do, but there might be other ways of presenting this, perhaps as part of a museum exhibition, or even maybe getting it published as a memoir of sorts. But then another part of my research involved interviewing other Vietnam veterans, just about their experience, and to get a little bit more of the details, and to be able to ask the questions about, like, oh, so he says this, what does this mean? Sometimes it's terminology, sometimes it's just mindset of those who were there that doesn't necessarily communicate 50 plus years later to those of us just reading it off the page. So I'm indebted to the other Vietnam vets who are willing to talk about it, since so many of them can't or won't, and find it very difficult to discuss that time. Many of them do sort of lock it away forever, which certainly the trauma research that I've come across indicates that's not the healthiest response, but sometimes it's the necessary response, to lock it away and hope to never open that up again.
So were some of the Vietnam vets that you talked to, were they friends with your dad, or were they just Vietnam vets in general?
One of them knew my dad, though not in the war at the time. But yeah, through family connections, I know some people who were there, who had very different experiences, but also there are universal themes to anyone who served in that war specifically, but in war in general. There are a lot of experiences that definitely now as a culture we're starting to acknowledge that trauma and PTSD in particular, like it's not just a wartime thing and not just for soldiers, but it is a part of the human condition that is day to day. And largely because of Vietnam veterans who came home and said, we need help. And the medical community did actually respond and began to classify post-traumatic stress disorder as something not specific to warfare. We now, as a society, we have the terminology and we have some of the tools that were developed solely for soldiers coming home. Now that is applicable to survivors of sexual assault, survivors of natural disasters, survivors of any kind of physical or emotional trauma. We have Vietnam veterans to thank for that, because prior to that, it was usually sort of signed off of like, okay, you went to war, obviously that's your own thing, and we're never really going to be able to relate, which is often the case, that those who have been through a traumatic experience feel like they can't relate to anyone who didn't also survive it themselves. So through the power of storytelling, through our vulnerability to talk about our own trauma, that hopefully as a society is a road to much more healing than we might have seen before. And
was your dad a member of any organizations that addressed this kind of? Because I know there's organizations that address this.
Yeah. The organization that he was most involved with in the last years of his life were a support group for those who had his condition, inclusion body myositis. So it's a condition related to and had been previously diagnosed as muscular dystrophy, but eventually was identified as its own thing. So the myositis organizations and support groups were really helpful for him. And it's not certain whether his condition was the result of Agent Orange exposure in the war, but that seems the most likely consequence. And one of the ways in which he differed from other members of that community was the early onset of that disease in his life, compared to many others who it happens much later.
So do you think down the road that you might even author a book on your dad's story?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, that definitely could be a possibility. For now, it's about turning it into a theatrical experience and a storytelling experience for those of us who can share the space together for a little while and balance the words on the page with the images on screen, with music that has been written for me, to find another way to balance the material and have musical interludes in between the stories. And when I first performed this show in 2019 at the Indie Fringe Festival in Indianapolis, a veteran told me afterwards that he really appreciated the structure of the show, going back and forth between stories and more abstract music and movement, because any time that he found in himself a triggering response of, oh, this is bringing stuff up for me, then sort of an abstract musical interlude would sort of help to process that for him. That he didn't just have to stuff it down, but he was able to sort of experience it in a healthy way and not just a triggering, gotta vent it kind of a way. And that's a real challenge to find in a live performance, a safe place for people to experience their own things while taking part in someone else's story. And I think that is one of the powerful things about theater and about people coming together to share something collectively.
So when you went to theater school, did you go to university or a specialized theater school? And did you develop these other elements in your show outside of that theater school with the ideas?
Well, my training is largely in theater, but that's mostly because that's how I grew up. I was on stage from the age of 3, and there have been very few times in my life that I haven't known when my next show was going to happen. And I thought for a while I wanted to be an actor, but then in high school I decided to major in music, which was sort of a funny thing for the actors that we knew, family and family friends, and the actors who worked with my parents in the theater. They all thought I was getting out. It was sort of like I was telling them I was going to go to med school, because they all thought, oh, as a musician, you might have a steady job. You have that possibility. And so then while I was in undergrad at Oberlin Conservatory, that's when I took a modern dance class and thought to myself, okay, yes, I am still committed to the music thing. I have so much training in theater, and growing up taking dance classes, I reawakened this part of myself that I knew that I couldn't do without anymore. So then I made the unlikely decision to major in music, theater, dance simultaneously, imagining a career for myself where I might be a dancing, acting, bass trombonist, not knowing where that would lead, but it's served me well despite everything that's happened. Like, I have been able to make a career out of being a hybrid artist. That's the word that we give to our work in my company, that we are multi-talented, and we're focusing on balancing different elements and taking the stream of musical storytelling along with text and theater and movement, and finding new ways to express ourselves and to express the work of our collaborators. So one of the things I wanted to include in this show was music, and though I am willing and capable of composing some of my own music, which does appear in the show, I wanted to collaborate with other composers. So I had the great privilege of being able to commission scores from several composers I know who took the stories that I had written, or at least the draft stories that I was working on, and take that idea and run with it and come back to me with just amazing musical and some sort of non-musical sounds to make with my bass trombone. Some of the pieces are solo trombone, and some of them are trombone with a backing track, a fixed media track that I get to play amidst this swirling soundscape, which is a beautiful challenge as a musician. But then to feel like that's in this theatrical space is really a joy. That the sound design of this theatrical experience is something that I helped create and set in motion.
So you mentioned that people know you from the Fruit Flies play before. So is this a big departure then from the Fruit Flies play?
Yeah. So I've performed on the Fringe theater circuit since 2013. So my company, The Fourth Wall, is celebrating our 10th year on the Fringe. We've toured North America. We've gone to many festivals in the U.S. and in Canada. And next month we're headed to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe for the first time ever. And what we normally do is much more, madcap variety show, family-friendly, vaudeville-inspired entertainment where the audience chooses the show order and we perform music by familiar composers, performing our, favorites from classical music reinterpreted with choreography and theatrical settings. But then also featuring the work of living composers who have written music expressly for the three of us. So that's something we've been doing for now 10 years. And so it was a few years ago when I decided I think I might be ready to do a solo thing. And I wanted it to be a personal story. So part of the show is autobiographical, but a lot of it is biographical through my father's writings and photographs.
So if people want to find out more about your company and your play, do you have a website or on social media? Yeah,
sure. So The Fourth Wall Ensemble is our name, and we're at www.thefourthwallensemble.com. And I'm at cneilparsons.com, though it's just me. I'm not a business. It's just my own little website. But my performing career is, multiple opportunities that I'm constantly trying to